The last pattern in the making method calls simpler series is called replace exception with test. The motivation here is that you're throwing an exception on a condition that we could have tested for explicitly, and so we're going to change the method to make that test instead of using an exception to handle that. Now we see this a lot in existing code bases. We'll see it in all kinds of different forms, some more subtle than others, but essentially what we're looking at here is we are breaking the cardinal rule of never use exceptions for logic flow. I know in the previous pattern I said exceptions are not something that we should be afraid of or avoiding, but we also shouldn't be using them for logic flow. I apologize in advance if I get a little ranty on this one. This is a huge pet peeve of mine that I see in a lot of code bases. So anyway, what we have here as an example is this method which gets a resource from a pool of shared resources. For this particular example, we're going to say that creating a new resource is a intensive process, something that's difficult to do but easy to reuse. A common example might be a database connection pool. Maybe not difficult to do, maybe that's not the right term, but is more expensive than simply reusing an existing one. So in this case, we have this try, which tries to get a resource from an existing stack of resources, and if it fails, it creates a new one, adds that to the allocated resources, and returns that result. Now, of course, there are a couple of things wrong with this try-catch. One we've already covered. We're using exceptions for logic flow, which is very, very bad. You should never, ever do that, of course. Another is that we're not actually handling the exception itself. We don't even look at what exception we're catching. We're assuming that this call is failing. We're assuming that it's failing in a specific way. What if this call fails? Or what if for some reason this call fails? We don't really discern between those. So instead of that, we're going to replace this with a more explicit test. So the first thing we're going to do is make that test. Let's say if available resources is empty, then we will create the new one. Add it to the existing allocated ones and return it. And now we can throw all of this into an else statement just to make it a little more explicit of the structure that we're using here. And so now, aside from the fact that this, I guess I'm just noticing now, this whole example isn't thread safe at all, because between making this check and this call here, another thread could come in and change that available resource count. So let's assume that thread safety is not an issue in this particular case. It's certainly outside of this example. So now when we get to this else block, we should never have this exception, or at least not the exception that we're assuming is going to happen, which, by the way, is not a particularly exceptional case, so shouldn't really use an exception for it. Getting back to that pet peeve of mine again. So we can remove the try and the catch block entirely in this case. And so now we're explicitly making that check and then responding to that. Now we've sort of reversed the order in which we're doing things. We've gone from having the difficult case on the bottom to having the difficult case on the top. We could change the conditional here and move those around. In fact, let's do that. It's greater than or equal to 1. Then let's go with the preferred case first. Then go with the non-preferred case. We might even, just for cleaning up, get rid of the else block entirely. I see some people who prefer doing that, some who don't. I mean, this is essentially it for the replace exception with test pattern, but we can clean this up a little more. Let's try consolidate duplicate conditional fragments, because we're seeing a lot of duplicate conditional fragments here. So let's say first we're going to return the result, and now we can get rid of these and compile and run our tests. Everything should still pass there. Now we have another duplicate fragment here. And so again, we can run our tests. Everything still passes. Now we can get rid of these brackets that we don't need. And so that was just applying another pattern. Again, that was called consolidate duplicate conditional fragments. But overall, the pattern that we're illustrating here is to just get rid of that assumed exception that we don't really know a whole lot about. Anything could have failed, and to replace that with an explicit test for the condition we're looking for. And that's it for the replace exception with test pattern, and also for the making method calls simpler series. Thanks for watching.